Now, to address the question from a slightly different point of view, Ian Rager wondered whether color naming is arbitrary across cultures. And see, the idea is that if linguistic relativism and linguistic determinism are correct, you'd imagine that if you take, any two languages that have never met and that have never interacted directly or indirectly, um, there should be no reason why the naming scheme of colors should be any similar. I mean, if linguistic relativism and determinism are right, if this is the space of color, one language can put its, can put its color words, perhaps one here, maybe one here, one there, and one there, as English does, right? So with some red, a yellow, a green, a blue. Another language could choose to do whatever they want. They could choose to put one exactly here in between yellow and green, and exactly there between red and blue, et cetera, and maybe one down here. There's no reason why any two languages should have a similar positioning of their color words in the color space. Again, in principle, there should be no relationship between the color labels of two languages. Again, assuming that these two languages have never had any circumstance for communication, directly or indirectly. So what Key and Rager did is something quite arduous. They collected the data in situ, which means they traveled to 110 different populations. And these were all, small culture, typically non-industrialized societies, which tended to be fairly isolated. And also that didn't have written language. And what they did is in each of these 110 societies, they pulled out their 320 color chips. And one by one, they said, what would you call this? And so they'd hear, and what would you call this? And what would you call this? And so this way, for every single one of these 110 languages, they had, I think, 24 or 25 people tell them how they would name each of these color chips. In other words, if you take this, you can segment and you can reconstruct for each language where it places its color labels. And again, you'd imagine if linguistic relativism and determinism were correct, that there should be no greater relationship than chance in where different cultures place their color words. Turns out the landscape is actually extremely different. On average, so you can see here the black dot is really the centroid of where, on average, these 110 different languages place their color words. And you can see there are these little lines around, just meaning that that's the centroid, but some might have placed, for example, green up here or down here or there, and maybe a few might have placed it here or there. Sort of, there's a spectrum. They don't all put it in the same place. There's a spectrum, but overall, it's a very organized structure, right? I mean, yellow really seems to be kind of somewhere around here. Sure, maybe in sometimes it's this tile, sometimes it's that tile, sometimes that tile, but it's kind of really here. Red is kind of really down here. Green tends to be in the middle right here. And you wouldn't expect this if language were purely arbitrary. I mean, again, any language could put their color labels wherever they want. Why on earth would they all be in a similar position? And so their interpretation of these data is that color terms seem to cluster around, meaningful colors, so-called focal colors. So the idea is not that we have an unrestricted ability, that languages just in an unrestricted way allocate their color labels. They actually cluster their color labels around focal colors, which are particularly important colors. And so as Key and Rager say, certain privileged points in color space, the focal colors, appear to anchor the color naming scheme of the world's system, viewed as a statistical aggregate, meaning overall, these focal colors just seem to anchor the color schemes of different languages. So it's not the case, again, that languages just develop whatever schemes they want. There's a natural concept, that of focal colors, which seems to attract the naming scheme across languages that have never met. Not only that, Rager also found that if you look at languages that have different numbers of color words, where they position their color words is fairly systematic, meaning there's a systematic relationship between the number of color words that are present in a lexicon in a given language and the space and where those labels are placed. Let me show you, for example, if a language only has two color words, well, typically those will be white and black or bright and dark. So white will occupy the top of the color spectrum, black will occupy the bottom of the color spectrum. If instead it has three color labels, typically the third color label that is added is almost always red. And when more color labels are added, the next ones tend to be green and yellow. And if they add one more, typically that tends to be blue. And if they add more color words, the next one tends to be brown. Do they have even more words? Well, then you tend to add things such as pink, purple, orange, and gray. So again, if linguistic determinism and linguistic relativism were correct, there'd be no reason why there's any systematicity in the way in which languages that have different numbers of color words should divide the color space. It should be purely arbitrary. Instead, as these data show, there clearly is a systematic relationship between the number of color words and where they are in space and how the space is partitioned among the available labels. So together, this data set and the previous one really seem to show that there is something fairly universal about naming schemes across different cultures. Now, a few years later, Rager reanalyzed these data from 110 languages, and they noticed something in how the languages were organized. In fact, this, just to give you an example before showing the rest of the data, so this is how the 5 labels of Brind'mo partition the color space. Again, remember, this experiment is where a participant is given one by one every single color tile from the color space, every single chip from the color space, and they're asked to name it. Okay. If you then aggregate 24 different people who have done this, you can create a map just by marking the area. For example, this area all had chips that fell in this area, typically were all given the same label, and chips in this area were all given the same label, and chips here and on the other side were all given the same label, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see that, as I said earlier, Brind'mo has 5 labels, sort of one that seems to occupy this red, one that occupies sort of dark colors down here, this giant one that, you know, occupies perhaps some space between the green and blue, yellow, and then kind of white up here, or bright. Now, what they did is they looked at other examples of languages that also had 5 color words. And what is striking, if you look at this first, is that again, and you wouldn't expect this if you believe linguistic determinism and linguistic relativism, the overall organization of where, or rather of how the space is partitioned by these 5 labels is extremely similar. It's really remarkable the degree to which, if I know that a certain language has X labels, I have a pretty good guess about how those labels are distributed in the color space. And in fact, you can see here a percentage of how similar each of these languages is to Birinmo. In other words, each of these languages, cultures that have never met each other, and also, again, cultures that don't have written language, typically don't use written language, so there can't be those kind of influences. Despite that, despite being far away, despite not having communicated, despite having different cultures, different histories, different location in space, the way in which their 5 labels partition the space of color is remarkably similar. In fact, way more similar than you'd ever expect, just by chance. However, notice also that the exact boundaries for each of the languages, well, that seems to be fairly flexible. You may notice, for example, that Birinmo has this dark, the dark label actually sort of covers the space and then comes back again here. And Beric has a generally similar layout, right? But in Giacque, very different, right? Now, it still is down here, right? It didn't suddenly sort of move position, but certainly different. And look at W06b, right? Same thing. The dark color sort of gets all of this space and climbs up a little bit, but the exact boundaries fairly different, right? And if you can look at every single one, the overall make of how this space is partitioned, extremely similar. Boundaries, pretty difficult, pretty different. And so this is what led Key and Rager a few years later in a summary where they were sort of doing a review and drawing a summary of all this work, to really infer that overall, as they say, this leaves us with an interestingly complex view of color naming. Ultimately, universalist, meaning there has to be other types of pressure that lead us to all develop a very similar type of naming scheme, naming convention. So ultimately universalist, but with a relativist hinge. And the idea is that whereas we seem to come into this world prepared to cut the space of color into specific categories, and those very clearly seem to be robust regardless of your specific culture. Nonetheless, there still seems to be space enough for linguistic convention to move around a little bit the boundaries. And this is what they mean by a relativist tinge. And really the way in which Key and Rager interpret this is that there probably are, the overall boundaries are created by our biological system. And in fact, they fall along the lines of the most optimal segmentation of the color space. And then linguistic convention can move these boundaries, can move the exact positioning of these boundaries.